Hi, my name's Shannon Halliday. I'm the writer and director of the Essential Church, and I'm here with Nathan Busenitz and James Coates. And we're going to talk about 2020 and what happened in the film and kind of the backstory to all that. So I'll open it up and I'll ask a question. I go to church here and I know the Master's Seminary, but why don't you tell me a little bit about the Master's Seminary and the connection there with James and you?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Shannon. So the Master's Seminary is really an outgrowth of Grace Community Church, right? When Pastor MacArthur came to Grace Church in 1969, he came with two primary goals. One was to preach the word, verse by verse, and the other was to train men. And the training of men in a 2 Timothy 2:2 sense to entrust these things to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. That's why the seminary exists, and it's why the seminary is on the campus of Grace Community Church, because we want the men who come here to train, men like James, we want them to see the local church in action. And really our goal is to implant in their hearts the convictions that are going to manifest themselves when they leave seminary and go out into their own church to minister the Word of God. And those convictions start with the Lordship of Jesus Christ and the authority and sufficiency of His Word. And so when the pandemic came, when the events of 2020 came, the events that are documented in the Essential Church and in the book that James and I put together called God versus Government, when those challenges came, it was about watching our students and especially our alumni living out the convictions that led them to take courageous stands, because courage is always based in conviction. And one of the things we so appreciated about James and what happened at GraceLife was we saw from here, we saw the convictions that we all share because they're convictions from the Word of God. We saw those convictions lived out in real time.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how did you hear about the seminary?
It was grace to you. John MacArthur's ministry began to really impact my life, and I was already desiring to go into ministry and even be trained, although at that point in time, I was in a place where I wanted to try and be trained for as little money as possible and as little cost as possible, if I could put it like that, because I was still paying down my undergraduate degree. I was now working and trying to pay that off. And so as I was considering going back to school to pursue pastoral ministry, initially my mind not being governed by the Word of God and not really understanding what I was sensing a call into, I was trying to find the easiest way to get trained to do that work. And then I came under the preaching of John MacArthur through Grace to You, and over time became convicted and convinced that I needed to be where his convictions would be instilled in me. I needed to learn how to accurately handle the word of truth. Yeah. And so it was really Grace to You that began to work in my heart. And at that point in time, there was nowhere to go but the Master's Seminary.
Yeah. Did you know at that time when you were listening to Grace to You and you were looking at seminaries, you were like, yeah, I want to be a pastor, or did it solidify as you were going to school?
No, I came here
before.
knowing that I wanted to preach the word, and John MacArthur's ministry was wonderful because obviously he is an incredibly gifted man and gifted not just in the context of our generation, but in the context of church history, an incredibly gifted man. Yeah. At the same time, he was doing something very simplistic in the sense that he was explaining the scriptures. Yeah. And I didn't see myself as really having charisma or the ability to kind of keep a crowd or win attention in that sense. But when I saw what he was doing, he was explaining the Word of God, I thought, I can do that. I just needed to be trained in how to do that. And so yeah, there's no question. It was his ministry that solidified that I wanted to preach the Word of God and preach expositionally.
Right. So your time here, how was that? Any poignant moments or stories that you can think of? Or?
James, talk a little bit about what you did for employment while you were here, and even the story that you told me about when you were invited to come preach at the Shepherd's Conference and you being on that platform behind the pulpit. Can you just share that? Because I think that's so intriguing.
Yeah, so I worked on custodial here at Grace Church, and it was great for me to have that job because it was humbling in many respects. Initially, guys would ask, what are you doing at Grace Church for work? And I said, I'm doing custodial, and then I would have to kind of explain why that was, saying, well, I'm an international student and all that kind of stuff. Well, over time, I came to love that job and love being able to serve here. And so I look very fondly on that opportunity that I had. And with that, you're in some awesome places on campus. I mean, there's times when I'm vacuuming the carpet behind John MacArthur's pulpit. And you can't help but have a moment where you get into the pulpit and just kind of go through a bit of a mock intro of what a sermon might look like. But when Dr. MacArthur invited me to preach at the Shepherd's Conference back in 2020, oh boy,
2021.
Because I couldn't make it to that one. I shared with Pastor John that I had vacuumed his carpet. He said, "Well, this is an upgrade on that," and as he would say, and it was quite a funny moment.
Yeah, how neat! Like you're vacuuming and then you're preaching the next day, and it's amazing. It's great. Okay, so you guys wrote a book together. Why don't you tell me about how that happened and why you wrote it?
Yeah, well, we both lived through, in different contexts, the reality of not just the pandemic. Obviously, everyone lived through the pandemic, but specifically, we had a front row seat to seeing government overreach and its impact on the local church and the life of the local church. And of course, all of that started in the spring of 2020. For us here in Los Angeles at Grace Community Church, things really heated up in the fall of 2020 with the court battle, and obviously the documentary goes into all of those details. And you guys in Alberta were facing similar things from the Alberta Health Authority, but for you, it really heated up in the spring of 21, and I'll let you tell a little bit about that story. But after all of those events, I asked Pastor John if he would be okay with me reaching out to James and collaborating on this story with Pastor John writing the foreword for the book.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to tell Grace Community Church's story without having Pastor John sort of give me his
Right.
blessing and approval, and he graciously did. And so I reached out to James, and James was so gracious to say, yeah, let's do it. And so, but talk a little bit about what happened in the spring of 2021, because that part, honestly, that part of the book is my favorite part of the book, and it's the most compelling part of the book, and just an amazing testimony of God's grace.
Well, I'm glad we did that, because the process of thoroughly going through step by step all that we went through and writing that down it's just a good exercise. And to have that captured in that book, I think is immensely valuable, not just for me personally, but for all those who read it. But basically, the governing authorities used every possible avenue they could to get us to submit. They used ticketing, they used the court of public opinion, media, and everything escalated when I was first arrested. This took place on a Sunday in the office of our church, and I was read my rights. I was arrested, given what's called an injunction. No, that's not what it's called. What's it called? You guys can edit
An undertaking.
This. Yes, thank you, sir.
See, I know that.
So I was arrested in...
The only reason I know it is because I had to ask you multiple times. Like, I don't know what that means, because you kept saying it in the interview. Yeah.
So I was arrested in our office, read my rights, served this thing called an undertaking, which compelled me to comply with the Public Health Act, which meant that I couldn't keep our doors open and hold church as we normally would. And so I was supposed to sign that and agree to its stipulations. And I said, well, I can't sign that. And so they said, well, that's fine. And the officer said, that's fine. We'll write refuse to sign. So where my signature would have gone, they wrote refuse to sign. But they said that it was still binding upon me. So the following Sunday, February 14th, 2021, we had service, and it was on the heels of that service that I was asked to turn myself in, which I did on Tuesday of that week. And so I turned myself in. I was brought before the justice of the peace, and the prosecutor on the case wanted me imprisoned. And she wanted me imprisoned because her belief was that if they imprisoned me, the church would stop meeting. The justice of the peace actually knew. He said, I don't think that's true. I think the church is going to meet anyway. And he didn't think that it warranted imprisonment. So he was going to order my release. And at that point in time, I was waiting to get the terms of the release. Would I be released with a condition, or would I have a condition that I must agree to be released? And it was the latter. I had to actually agree to this condition. It was the same old thing. I had to comply with the Public Health Act. And it meant that if I ever stepped foot on the grounds of GraceLife Church, we had to be in compliance with all of the health orders at that time. Social distancing, masking, capacity limits, all of that. Well, I couldn't sign. It was the same thing, same issue that we had the whole time. So I said I can't sign that condition. And then at that point in time, it was interesting watching the system try and figure out, what do we do when a guy doesn't sign? Because, criminals sign. Yeah, they sign wherever they can, and they're out on the streets again. So I said, yeah, I can't sign, and that meant going to court the following morning, which I did in shackles, no less, handcuffed and in shackles. And at that point in time, I was going to be transferred to Edmonton Remand Center, a maximum security prison, and I was going to be there until the courts kind of figure out what was going to happen with my condition, because we were going to contest it and appeal it to see if they could change the terms of it. And that was going to take time, and it took 35 days.
Yeah.
So I was in jail for 35 days. Somewhere along the way, the Crown, which is the prosecution, had deemed it necessary to modify my conditions, and they were now willing to talk. The courts wouldn't do it, so the prosecution had to do it, and there was a deal that was struck that would allow me to leave the jail without compromising my integrity.
Can you talk a little bit about the ministry that you had with some of the fellow prisoners while you were there? And then you got to tell the story about what happened when you left.
Yeah. Well, so ministry in prison is, it just comes to you. I mean, they knew I was there. They were hearing it on the radio. They were reading it in the paper. So the inmates knew that I was there. So when I got transferred from the quarantine unit, where we were in effect basically locked in our cell for 23 and a half hours a day, out twice for 15 minutes, we got transferred to GP, general population. And at that point in time, we had, 3 one-hour exercises a day, as I recall. And so when I'm in my cell, there were inmates coming to my cell right away. The first day that I was there, the first afternoon that I was there, and they're knocking on my door saying, "Hey, are you the pastor?" And they wanted me to pray for them. In one case, a gentleman came over and told me about how his 5-year-old son, as I recall, died in a fire, and how that gentleman was wrestling with the reality of God existing and his son having died. And so here I am trying to minister to this man who's lost his son, and to pray for him and share the gospel with him. So yeah, opportunities would come, and even Bible study. There was a gentleman that wanted a Bible study, and so he was coming to me and almost badgering me to host a Bible study. And so I sat down at a table just like this on the floor of our pod and opened my Bible, and 5 guys or so came and sat down, and I began to take them through key texts in the Gospel of John. And there was even a point when they wanted me to host a Sunday service. So guys were saying, "Hey, host a Sunday service." And so I thought, well, I better ask if I can do that. And I asked the guards if I could do that, and that set off a chain of events that brought me to this higher up guard who expressed that he would prefer it if I didn't do that. So I didn't. And but yeah, the opportunities to minister were amazing. And so there was a relationship that was established with the inmates, and that final day was something. I'll give you kind of the long version of it since we're here and have this time.
Yeah, sure.
So I just found out that I was going to be released, and I'm now back up in my cell, and the radio's starting to announce the pastor's going to be released, And I hear on the intercom, "Coates, be ready. You could be out any minute." Well, one of the chaplains came, and he wanted to see me because he had heard that I was going to be released, and he had been interacting with me throughout the time there. There were 2 chaplains in particular that did. And so I had to go down from the 3rd floor to the bottom floor, and I'm thinking, well, I better bring my bag, because if I go down there and they say it's time to go, if I'm going to be ready, I got to be ready, right? He told me to be ready. So there was one guy down this way, away from the stairs, that I wanted to talk to. I just wanted to express words to him, and I can't recall exactly what it was, but I had an affection for him, and so I wanted to express some words. Likely I wanted to be praying for him. And so I took my bag with me and began to head down that way quickly, because you're trying to do everything fast when you're in prison. And they haul it up from the floor, and they said, "You don't need your bag. Put your bag away." So I put my bag away. But in that whole thing, there began to be noise coming from the cells that were aware that he might be leaving right now. So there was already I'm thinking, me leaving is somewhat significant. There was kind of a ruckus coming from the cells as guys were seeing out their window that, "Oh, look, he's leaving." Well, I went down, spoke with the chaplain. While I'm talking to the chaplain, they're like, "Coates, you're leaving." So we stand up, the chaplain and I, holding hands. He's praying for me. And then I amen, boom, I go upstairs, grab my bag. I come down. My floor is on exercise, so I'm saying goodbye to those guys. And then I began heading for the door. And as I'm heading for the door, that same kind of ruckus that I was hearing earlier, I begin to hear again. So I turn around and I wave to the whole pod. And the place erupts. The guys are in their cells just banging on the doors. And it was amazing because I knew this was a moment. And I looked over at the guards to my left, and I could see on their faces that this was they were witnessing a moment too. This was significant. Even the chaplain who was there said he would never forget that moment. It was kind of a Hollywood moment, to be honest with you. And so yeah, really just an amazing moment. And then the moment thereafter, as soon as I go through those doors and leave that pod, at that point in time, you're a prisoner, you're property, you're a unit. So you go from this epic sort of emotional moment to just the awful aspect of what it is to be in prison.
Yeah. I have a question for you. And I've said this in other podcasts when people interviewing me about you. And I say, he went to maximum security prison, but he didn't know he was going to be in there for 35 days. He could have been in there for the next 2 years or longer. So if you put yourself in your shoes, that's a huge burden, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I really did not know what was going to happen. I couldn't have known how everything was going to play out. And even when I went in, there was the possibility. So in the whole saga leading up to my arrest, we blew through a court order. AHS, which is the health governing body in Alberta, took us to court, and the courts ordered us to comply with the Public Health Act. At that point in time, we could appeal it, but if you appeal it, you ought to really comply until the appeal is decided. And we're like, well, that could be 6-8 weeks. We don't want to comply for 6 or 8 weeks. So we had a huge meeting that Friday night and wrestled hard, 4-hour meeting, and decided that we were going to open up and be in contempt of court. And this actually dovetails with Jacob Riom in Ontario, who's a friend of mine. He was going to be opening up in contempt of court that Sunday as well. So we opened up that Sunday in contempt of court, and so had AHS taken us back to court to be held in contempt, that comes with a maximum penalty of 2 years in prison. So while I was in prison for refusing to sign my condition, AHS could have taken us to court, and I could have been sentenced while I was in there, and my refusing to sign my condition could be turned into an actual sentence where I'm paying time for contempt of court. So I didn't know. I had no idea. And plus, at that point in time, the COVID thing just didn't seem like it was going to go away. Yeah. It was going to be here for perpetuity, in perpetuity. So I had no idea. All I could do was obey the Lord. I knew what the Lord was calling me to do, and all I could do was obey Him. And the rest of it was His. I could have lost it all, but it would have been worth it. And my wife and I were even reminiscing today because it's her first time back to LA since seminary. And, you know, I said to my wife today, I said, as difficult as it was, as hard as it was, and it was hard spiritually, physiologically, mentally, emotionally, in every way it was hard. As hard as it was, in light of what I've seen the Lord do since then, I mean, it was nothing. And I mean, we can compare it to his work on our behalf, and that would be an even greater infinite nothing. But yeah, in the moment, I had no idea how it was going to go. But when you look back in hindsight, I mean, the Lord has just blessed the stand that our church took together.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the documentary, we show that, and we talked to Tim Stevens about that. We talked to John MacArthur about that, and the elders. And there was exponential growth at Grace Community Church, and that was the same with Tim and you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? What kind of new people or things like that you've witnessed?
Yeah, I mean, our church has certainly doubled at times, nearly tripled. We were averaging about 350 pre-COVID annually, and I think now we're, you know, we've had up to 950 and above, somewhere 850, 900. We're trying to figure that out, but yeah, I mean, our church has grown numerically for sure, and it's been amazing because people have been coming to GraceLife Church from all kinds of places. In some cases, they came and got saved. In other cases, they left churches that were closed and unsound, and so we've had to really integrate them into a church that preaches the word, that takes theology and doctrine very seriously. So the fundamentals of the faith course that we run, that was birthed here at Grace Community Church, we've been using that and it's been amazing the way Jacob Spence, our associate pastor, has used that ministry to get people plugged in and grounded in the word. And so it's been amazing. I mean, we'd love to get back into a situation where we could gather in one service, and but yeah, I mean, we are loving ministry for sure.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that we've seen that with a lot of alumni churches, with TMS churches. And Pastor MacArthur made the comment that, you know, no one would have chosen a global pandemic as a church growth strategy, but it's certainly resulted in that because people who are looking for churches that have conviction, I think the pandemic exposed a lot of churches. And as a result, good churches are growing in ways that are unprecedented. And we're seeing that here in the States. We're seeing that in Canada. We're seeing that where our alumni are out pastoring faithfully. Yeah. It's been amazing.
Yeah, it taught you a lesson, and the valuable lesson of making that stand that we made. So, all right. So, do you guys have any questions on your mind? Thoughts about the documentary, anything like that? To me, each other, anything else?
I have a question for you, Shannon.
Okay.
So I know you shot hours and hours and hours of footage.
Yeah.
You probably know the total number of hours or an approximate. And I know that when you first did your rough edit, it was much longer than the final. So talk a little bit about the good footage that didn't make it into the documentary.
Yeah. There was a lot, and it was really painful to cut a lot of it. And the decision making of cutting it was really, you know, I'm making a movie. I'm telling a story. And so you have to care about the craft of storytelling. You can try to put everything in there, but you'll also make a really bad movie if you do that. But the problem with that is you have things that you have to get rid of that you love. There's stories that you just told right now that actually didn't make the documentary. And it pained me. But I mean, I have a 2-hour film at that point, and I have all these intertwining stories, and you know, I have to pick my choices there. And so, I mean, honestly, you could have had a movie alone on the Canadian stuff. There was so much there. But I really liked how we did it, and that we interwove church history with it and things like that, and I really liked that. But yeah, to answer your question, you know, I interviewed John MacArthur, and I interviewed him like 4 different days, and we're talking lots of hours with John MacArthur, and he's so kind because I was asking him questions that had nothing to do with the documentary at all. And he knew it, and he would just answer it the best he could, and he wouldn't complain. But then he said to somebody, I forget who he said, he's like, I don't know why he's asking me these questions. I'm a little concerned. But he never like shut me down. He never like complained. He was like, and he even said last night at our elders premiere, he said, I had to exercise a little faith because during the interviews, I had no idea what we were talking about. So I have these amazing stories, like stories of him going to the hospital to minister to an individual when he was much younger, the young lady who accidentally severed her spinal cord and became a quadriplegic. And that was his first opportunity to like minister stuff. And it kind of fit because it was at a hospital. And I could have had that in there, and I had it. I loved the story, and you know, I just had to cut it because at the end of the day, it was a little bit of a rabbit trail, and so that hurts. But also the data aspect of it, like there's lots of like I could have had 30 minutes of just bashing Fauci. And it's very cathartic, and I was like, I edited this thing together, and it's super. I mean, I just loved it. But when I was honest with myself, I was like, is that really what the story is about? You know, so I had to cut certain things like that. But fortunately, there are such things as Blu-rays and DVDs, and those are bonus features that will be in the Blu-ray and the DVD. So you can see more uncut interview stuff of Scott Atlas, who's was on the task force for Trump, as you know. And he has amazing stories. He has an amazing part in the documentary still that I think is really powerful. Yeah, so it was hard. But at the end of the day, I'm making a movie. I'm not writing a book. It's not meant to be totally comprehensive. You have to be able to sit there for however long and feel like satisfied that you watched a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a protagonist that moves you through the story. And it has to move. You know, and if you have things that are redundant and repetitive, you have to ask yourself, well, which one is the best thing? Because I got to get rid of the other thing. You know, so
the really important question, is whether there's any B-roll footage on the ice.
Oh no, I know.
At the hockey rink.
Yeah, you want to talk about killing your babies? It's bad. It was bad. Yeah. I loved that moment. So we went, I don't know if you know this because it's not in the documentary. You've seen it. He has not seen the documentary. But Nate
Maybe
has.
You should keep him in suspense.
Yeah, no, I think I've told him already. But we rented an ice hockey rink, and we went out there, and I had this idea that somehow I was going to weave in this like competitive vibe to it because J-Mac was an athlete. James is an athlete, and I thought maybe there was a connection there. So when I wrote the script, I kind of had a moment there that I was trying to create. I realized it didn't work at the end of the day, and I had to cut it. But yeah, so I had James run sprints on skates, basically, right? Doing like what is it called? Is there a thing?
Wind sprints.
Wind sprints. And so he'd go, like if you're on a football field, he'd go to the 50, then back and forth until he does the whole field, you know?
Yeah.
And they looked really great. And
so here's the thing. So I've been playing hockey lately, and we started with the wind sprints.
Yeah.
So we finished this 4-hour venture doing like, you know, skating in and shoot, you know, some really low-key stuff. But we began with the wind sprints. So here I am, I haven't had any lunch, you know, I get on the ice, and I just start giving her in wind sprints, and I nearly died twice. So I had to take a time out, go into this is the B-roll footage we should have got. I had to go into the dressing room and just suck air for a few minutes to kind of get my wherewithal. Went back out, did it again, and was worse, like 45 minutes.
Yeah.
I thought I was gonna die.
he was over a trash can.
Yeah, oh, there was definitely a trash can. Absolutely. And I didn't need it, but I mean, it was close. So then after I kicked that second, I triumphed over nearly dying a second time.
Yeah.
Then I was good.
Dude,
then
you
I was
were
good.
a trooper. You were a trooper, and you did great. And I imagine when you got the camera on you, you're like, well, it's all out. I got to go for it.
Absolutely.
Which is what you did, and it was great. And it looked great. I mean, we had the Ronin, like it's a steady cam, and our DP, Nate, was on skates. So he was skating behind him, and I'm out there with the monitor. I'm like, do it again, do it again. And then,
My favorite was snow jobbing, Seth.
Yeah.
So Seth's got the camera right on the ice, and he's waiting for me to come, and so I just bolt and then brake, stop right in front of the cam.
Yeah.
He's like, I wasn't expecting that.
I'll have to edit together, and if we don't put it on the DVD, maybe we can at least put it on social media. It wouldn't be that hard to edit together, and at least then it wouldn't be complete waste. We can see James in action.
Well, what I do love about the documentary and what you're going to see on Sunday is the story that you do tell, which doesn't get hockey in there, but the story that you do tell is so clearly a story of God's sovereign goodness. And really, I mean, the whole theme, it's so evident, right, that Christ is the head of the church, not the state, and no human being, right? It's Christ alone who is the head of the church.
Yeah.
And so we submit to him, and that comes through so clearly in the film. So I know there's a lot that you wanted to get in there that doesn't get in there, but the story that you do tell, I think, is really, really clear.
Yeah.
I can't wait.
Yeah. I think the thing that I'm most proud of about it is the way the church history was able to be wove in there. Because I had that concept when I wrote it and when I pitched it, and that I would do that. And that part really worked out. And there was obviously certain changes where I'm like, oh, actually it goes better here, and that kind of thing. But it really, when I saw it come together and I finally saw it with everything, I was like, okay, it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was really happy with that.
Yeah, with the Covenanters, I thought that was really compelling.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
No mere mortal is the head of the church, Christ alone
That's
is the head
right,
of the
yeah.
church.
Yeah, it was a venture, and it was really a blessing, and I recognize God's sovereign hand in it because I did not pursue something like this. It really was a door that just opened, and I recognized it, and I'm like, well, guess I'll walk through and see what happens, and then just started working on it. And we're a big church, and there's lots of folks here, and sometimes things, get micromanaged, and that didn't happen at all. And we were just left alone. Of course, if they didn't like it, they would have given us notes and said, you got to change X, Y, and Z. But fortunately, they liked it. And, I recognize God's sovereign hand in that, and it was a blessing. It's an answer to prayer. I've prayed about doing work like that in my field, specifically, for like the last 10 years. And so when it just happens and you see how it happens and where you tried to make it happen like years before, and it was just like shut door after shut door and it's not working, and you're like, well, I guess the Lord doesn't want me to do it that way. And you just kind of forget about it after a while. You're like, well, I guess that was the answer. The answer was no. But the answer wasn't no. The answer was yes. And the Lord was just going to do it the way he wanted to do it, and it was better. And so I recognize God's mercy and kindness to me in the whole process, so I'm thankful. It's a great experience.